The United States has laid out the conditions it expects Canada to meet during the review of their key free trade deal. Conditions the U.S. Trade Representative says must be met in order to keep CUSMA for the long term.
The U.S. to lift those punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos.
Alcohol, dairy, and energy, all three made the list of demands from the U.S. if it is to remain in the three-way trade agreement with Canada and Mexico known as CUSMA.
Canada made a move that stunned everyone watching. When the US pushed its demands, Canada didn't wait or negotiate. It refused them all right away. No deals, no middle ground. This could be a big win for Canada's strength and independence, while the US may face a rare setback, and this could just be the beginning of something bigger. Starting with dairy, which has been the most persistent American grievance in Canada-US trade negotiations for decades. US producers have argued that Canada's supply management system functions as a protectionist barrier, imposing tariffs of between 200 and 298% on imports beyond fixed quotas. The American framing presents this as unfair market restriction. The Canadian reality is that supply management stabilizes domestic production and protects thousands of family farms, concentrated particularly in Quebec, from the kind of price volatility that has devastated agricultural communities in other markets. What changed this cycle is not that Canada defended the system, it has always defended it rhetorically. What changed is that Canada passed legislation permanently protecting supply management, effectively removing it from the negotiating table as a matter of law. Even if the government wanted to concede, the legislation now prevents it. A bargaining chip has been transformed into a structural constant. The digital media demands followed a parallel logic. Canada's online streaming and online news legislation require platforms operating in the Canadian market, including Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube, to reinvest a portion of their Canadian revenue back into domestic content production and to compensate publishers for news distribution. Washington characterized these requirements as discriminatory against American technology companies. Canada characterizes them as essential to cultural survival in a media environment dominated by American platforms. The financial stakes behind that framing difference are not minor. These rules redirect billions in revenue flows annually. The debate is not abstractly about fairness. It is specifically about who controls the content pipeline of a country that shares a language and a border with the world's largest media machine. Government procurement produced one of the most structurally awkward moments in Washington's demands. The US case was that provinces, including Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, systematically favored domestic suppliers, blocking equal access for American companies. The awkwardness is that the United States enforces Buy American policies across federal contracts, military spending, and infrastructure programs, often with strict domestic sourcing requirements that exceed what any Canadian province imposes. Carney's refusal on this demand was not just strategic, it was almost logically required, because conceding would mean abandoning a policy framework that the United States itself relies on to protect its own industries. The alcohol bans, which might appear to be the most easily resolved of the 5 demands, actually reveal the sequencing problem embedded in the entire conflict. Several Canadian provinces restricted American beer and wine directly in response to US tariffs on Canadian goods. Washington's demand to lift those bans without simultaneously removing its own tariffs asked Canada to stop defending itself while the pressure remained in place. That is not a negotiating proposal. It is a compliance request. Canada declined it on the same terms it declined the others. What was conspicuously absent from the 5 demands is as telling as what was included. Automobiles, the most economically integrated sector in the bilateral relationship, the one where parts cross the border multiple times before final assembly, where Canadian factories supply American vehicles and American plants supply Canadian production lines, were not aggressively targeted. That absence was not an oversight. The auto industry operates as a single continental system that saves tens of billions of dollars annually through integrated supply chain efficiency. When the full complexity of that interdependence was laid out before Congress, it became clear that disrupting the automotive system would damage American manufacturers as severely as Canadian ones. Washington's silence on autos was strategic, not generous. The companies most exposed to disruption are already warning about consequences and urging stability, creating internal pressure on the administration from within its own industrial base. The most consequential strategic move, however, was not a refusal, it was an expansion. While Washington was framing its demands, Canada was opening new trade channels most visibly toward China, where targeted agreements on canola, electric vehicles, and agricultural exports established what Carney described as friendly nation tariffs. Not a comprehensive free trade agreement, but enough to reopen markets that had been effectively restricted. When Trump initially responded by threatening 100% tariffs if Canada became a conduit for Chinese goods, Ottawa clarified immediately that no free trade agreement was being pursued and no existing clauses were being violated, a position confirmed directly in talks between Dominic LeBlanc and Greer himself. That exchange illustrated what the diversification strategy is actually doing. Every new trade channel, every reopened export market, and every domestic procurement policy redirecting capital inward reduces the degree to which a single bilateral relationship can function as leverage. That shift is visible in the numbers. Canadian exports to the United States historically represented approximately 75% of total Canadian exports, a dependency that defined decades of economic policy and constrained every trade negotiation Canada entered. That figure is declining through deliberate structural choices, including agricultural access to China, expanding European trade ties, and domestic procurement policies, redirecting roughly $70 billion toward Canadian suppliers. The leverage Canada currently holds in this standoff is partially a function of the energy relationship the United States imports approximately 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude oil per day, accounting for roughly 23% of total American refinery feedstock, with Gulf Coast refineries specifically engineered to process Canadian heavy crude. That dependency is not a negotiating variable. It is a physical infrastructure reality. The internal messaging from Washington has not been consistent on the agreement's value, which is itself informative. Trump has publicly questioned whether the trade deal has outlived its usefulness. Greer's congressional testimony cited $960 billion in US exports to Canada and Mexico under the deal, and a 56% increase in exports since its implementation. Those two positions cannot be simultaneously correct. And when nearly 150 American industry leaders, from steel, energy, agriculture, and automotive sectors urged continuation of the agreement, it confirmed that the business community's assessment of the deal's value diverges significantly from the rhetorical framing in Washington's public posture. Three outcomes sit on the table as the July deadline approaches: a full 16-year extension, a complete withdrawal by one side, or a shift into annual reviews that would extend uncertainty through 2036. The assumption that Canada will ultimately accept revised terms to avoid disruption is grounded in a model of the relationship that reflects where Canada was, not where it is. The legislation is in place. The alternative markets are open. The domestic investment is being redirected. What looks from the outside like defiance is, underneath, a calculated repositioning toward a different economic architecture, one built around flexibility and leverage rather than dependence and accommodation. The real question now is not whether this standoff continues. It already has. The question is, which side adapts first to the reality both sides helped create?